Today on the 50 Most Relevant, we're about to farewell the things. Yeah, number 30 is Hawthorn midfielder Will Day. What does this coming season hold for him and for Hockball? We are going to talk about all that and more on today's episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me is a man that we've had already on this season's 50 Most Relevant, but if you love things like analytics, specifically around the area of rucks, but today we're expanding out what this great man has brought to the SuperCoach and AFL Fantasy community over the last couple of years. He's a regular staple as a part of the Dr. SuperCoach clan. It is peak mentality. Mate, good to see you again. Second episode into the 50 Most Relevant this year, and Will Day, wow, this could be an interesting pick if a few things break right for him in 2025.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on again, MJ, and good to see you here. Good hair, looking good as always.
Don't you start.
Will Day, another guy with good hair.
Don't you start. I thought I liked you for a minute.
No, you're looking good. Will Day's looking good as a commonality here. And look, he's a really good, interesting guy to talk about because I think we all know he's got a lot of upside and it just hasn't quite come off for him yet. But, you know, there's a pathway where it could this year. There's a pathway where it could just stay stagnant again this year and might be a couple of years down the track. But I think he's someone that we all think will become a great player. Just when is a question that we need to have a chat about.
100%. We are going to deep dive into Will Day today. Before we do, a massive thanks to a couple of brand new premium tier Patreons. If you want to support the Coaches Panel this pre-season, get some additional great content, access to a bunch of different elements, and, well, get early access to the podcast. That is just some of the rewards that come to different tier levels of Patreons. Those that have just recently jumped in at the premium tier: Susie Black, Glenn Townsend, and Michael Welton. Hey, thank you so much to you three. You have all jumped in recently as premium supporters of the Coaches Panel. We are grateful for you and hope you're enjoying your experience as a Patreon of the Coaches Panel. Last year, a little bit of an interrupted season for Will Day is slightly, it's not hyperbolic, it's pretty factual. Just the 16 games last year, but a seasonal average of 91.2 for us in SuperCoach means he's at a price point of $491,300, while in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, an average of 74.1 means he's just on that $750,000 price point in Dream Team, and he's actually $760K exactly in AFL Fantasy. Last year, a career high score in SuperCoach, a 142 against Port Adelaide back in May of last year, while he only really hit his peak score last year in fantasy was a 109 against the Giants. You got to go back to 2023 for his career high score in AFL Fantasy. That was a 128 against North Melbourne, right back near the start of the 2023 season. Will Day's such a fun player to have a conversation about because he burst into the AFL community and onto the AFL scene kind of midway through his debut season and showed poise, showed his skill, showed his ability to hit targets, not just on these easy little dinky 30, 40-meter kicks that are on an angle to no one there. He takes the game on with how he moves the ball, specifically by foot, but he does have some really clean hands to go alongside it. He adds this dynamic layer of skill and poise to a Hawthorn team now that he's moved into the midfield over the last couple of years that is a little bit more crash and bash style of Newcomb, Warple, and Nash. He adds this fresh dynamic to a Hawthorn side that takes them from physically imposing to now a skillful, exquisite user of the ball. He's a compelling piece to this Hawthorn midfield.
Yeah, he definitely is. And I'm a Bombers fan. I grew up watching the Bombers in the late 90s and 2000s, and James Hird was my favourite player. I can't remember who it was, but someone on a podcast last year saw that, you know, Will Day has these kinds of James Hird tendencies, and I just can't get it out of my head now when I watch him. It's that kind of still big enough to play midfield, but silky, hard to tackle, great by feet, can get forward, do some damage up forward. So when someone mentioned that comparison, I just haven't been able to get it out of my head since, and I'm just kind of waiting for him to, I don't know if he'll win a Brownlow like I heard he did, but he's got that talent about him and just that kind of X factor that you're right, Hawthorn do need, because they do just have some bulls in there. Good players in Warple, Newcomb and Nash, no ways about it. But yeah, not as silky outside, especially some of their disposal by foot by those guys isn't always the best. So I think he's absolutely someone that is important to them, but how much midfield time he'll get will be interesting.
Shopping in this mid-price range feels like we've got 50 different options in 2025. And throughout this podcast, a little bit later on, Pig, I do want to ask you, how do we prioritize well, given it feels like we could almost fill the entire 8 midfield spots this year with mid-price guys that have a risk profile? That's how they got to an element of this value space, but have unbelievable upside last year. Yeah, again, interrupted through injury a couple of times through there. An AFL fantasy average of 74 doesn't look great. 7 games under 80 doesn't look great. Just the 3 tons doesn't look great. But what we're looking for is trends and something that we can expound into a new year. Last year's pain can be the new year's gain. And last year, between round 9 to 16, he averaged 94.1 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. That's a 20 points per game jump from what he's priced at, which is really the bare minimum we need him to do. The good thing is, between that and what he did in 2023, there's some scoring confidence we can gain. So too in SuperCoach, a seasonal average of 91.2. There's 9 tons. So you talk about a better SuperCoacher with just his quality of ball use, not just the volume of ball use. He's also got 3 scores, 120 plus. And between rounds 10 to 20, he's averaging 114. So this is now not just good value for money at a low 90s. We are talking about a player who has, over a 10-week stretch, matching it with right near the top line premium midfielders for us. In that stretch of games, 9 tons, nothing under 92. And again, validation that what we saw in 2023 wasn't just a pop on the radar. In that year, by the way, an average of 95 in fantasy, 7 tons, including a 128 and 5 additional scores, 90 plus, while in SuperCoach, 8 tons, 3 over 120, and an average of 97.4. The signs are here for us, aren't they, Pig? And we've got a little bit of value with that game. He went off in the final game of the year. He plays 5% of the game, gets a 10 in SuperCoach and 8 in AFL Fantasy. So just that alone's just really clunked down that average for us and subsequent price point. But talk to me about, can he break out? And what's the pathway potential to him breaking out? We've seen it for 8 games here, 10 games there. Have you got some stats for us? I know that's what you bring to the community, is great data and analytics that says what he's been doing as opposed to what others that have broken out. Are there some parallels for us that we can build some confidence around what Will Day might become for us in 2025?
Yeah, no, there definitely is. And he does have a really nice build in terms of how he plays the game and scores in a variety of areas. Last season, I looked at players who had the potential to break out and become, what we called first-time premiums. I defined these players, I did the ruck separately, but I defined these other players, so your mids, defenders, forwards, guys who'd never averaged 100 SuperCoach, and then they finally cracked and went even bigger and went 105 plus. So I looked back over the last 5 years and what did all these people have in common? And it was that they scored in a variety of ways. So they all got plenty of disposals, marks, tackles, contested possessions, and clearances. We know that contested possessions and clearances in SuperCoach especially give you bonus points. So they had to, it wasn't just that they racked up on the outside, because they also needed kind of clearances and contested possessions. But the other part of that, they really need a consistent role in the team, and it needs to be like a fantasy-friendly role. So there are guys coming through that, I can see, look ahead, they've got a really good game. I'm thinking like Ben Hobbs and Josh Ward, his teammate here. They've got the game, but I really don't think they're going to have that role. So I'm not going to recommend them as a breakout candidate. So last year when I did this, it identified players like Harry Sheasel, Hayden Young, Chad Warner, Jai Newcomb and Will Day were kind of the big 5 as having the game style and the consistent role to break out. And absolutely, Sheasel, Young and Warner, they had great years, and I would consider them a successful breakout. We know that Newcomb and Day didn't quite get there in 2024, but maybe I was just 1 year too early recommending them. So in Will Day's case, injuries and the associated low time on ground that comes with injuries did hurt him. If we look at games when Will Day had over 70% time on ground, and that's not even that big of an amount, that's just like a solid benchmark. He averaged 103 SuperCoach in those games of 70%. So that's good. It's not great. Whether it's enough to, if he replicated that and went 103, would you be happy? It's kind of right in that borderline. So he's got the fantasy game to do it. He can score in every kind of aspect that we need. But the worry I have for Will Day is his CBAs and, what number in the pecking order is he for Hawthorn? Because if we look at 2024, John Newcomb was the number one midfielder all year. He averaged about 73% CBAs. He increased that to about 80% in the last 5 and finals. But that was when Will Day was out, so was that bump because of that. But then you've got James Worpel at 67% and Connor Nash at 65%. They were the two guys behind Newcomb. So that meant Will Day is actually the number 4 midfield option at the Hawks last year, playing about 61% CBAs when he's playing. So obviously some of those games he's injured and it really skews the stats, but it's not like it's Newcomb and Day being the two dogs. So there is still Worpel and Nash in there. So what I really want to know is, can he leapfrog Worpel and Nash to become the new number 2 mid? That's what I would really like to see in the season to get me excited, but we don't know. And that's without mentioning there are some young guys like Cam McKenzie and Josh Ward. They had really big CBA spikes towards the end of the year. And probably part of that was because Day was out. But those are two really high draft picks that the Hawks think are great. So do they get some midfield time? There's quite a few mouths to feed here. And I did look, the reason I talk about CBA is I did look at the last 2 seasons. So I've gone and looked at the top 10 SuperCoach scoring mids by average in the last 2 years. So top 10 for 2023, top 10 for 2024. That's 20 players. 19 of those 20 top SuperCoach mids were either the number 1 or number 2 CBA mid at their club. So there's only one player, and that was Christian Petrarca in 2023, that was able to be a top tier mid while not being either number 1 or number 2 at his club. And we don't need Will Day to be a top 10 mid to be a good pick. Yeah. But that is just showing that CBA percentage does correlate highly to SuperCoach scoring. So he might be okay just going at that 103 he did last year when not injured, but I'd be a lot more happy and a lot more confident if we got some news that he had leapfrogged Worpel and Nash and was going to be the number 2 guy, because that's his pathway really becoming great. What are your thoughts on that? Because, there's a bit going on at Hawthorn.
There's a lot of options for them, not just now, but you throw in a Barras and a Battle too. That defensive line can look drastically differently. When I look at Hawthorn last year, you've got to ask yourself whether it's causation or correlation. But last year, Will Impact missed the first handful of games to start the year, and they're 1-5 in the first 6 rounds of the year that he didn't play. And the one they beat was North Melbourne. And this is where Kane Corns comes out and starts talking about this is the worst list in the AFL and that they will be rebuilding for a decade. Well, Will Day comes in round 7. And from this point on until the end of the season in home and away, they go 13 wins and 4 losses. Now, is it all just Will Day? That's why I'm like, is it just this handy thing that happens to go, all the variables pop? Or is he this piece to the midfield that even though he might never get to the top 2 centre bounce presence, is there something about structurally what he does that makes this unit function? Is it something about his ball use through the middle as a transition scorer? He's fine at stoppage, by the way. He's fine. But it's what he does with the ball, with a metre or 2 of space, that really now creates that great ball movement, score impacts, all those key things that we know Hawthorn has needed from him. So to me, I'm actually fascinated to see this midfield split this year, because you're right. McKenzie and Ward gave us enough reason without Day, especially in that final series, to go, well, we're okay here without Will Day. Do we need a bit more creative ball movement off half back? Yeah, Amon's been fine, but do we need to change that? Because to fit Newcomb, Worpel, Nash, now McKenzie, now Ward, now Day, who we're talking about, they all can't sit in that spot. I know Ward has played some wing. I know McKenzie's played some stuff. To me, I do think it's a very interesting time that Day's in the side and the side gets cracking. It might not be the only reason, but to me, it's an interesting correlation at the very least for us to consider. You talked about, Pig, about the value on investment. Like, he's got that 10-game stretch last year, or 10-round stretch, should I say, of 114 in SuperCoach and sort of an 8-week stretch where he goes 94 in fantasy. I think if he goes anything less than 95 in AFL Fantasy, less than 90, 95 might be about the peak of it. It's probably a failed mid-price selection, especially with an early buy to navigate. But in SuperCoach, how do we validate this one? Because in AFL Fantasy, we've got just 2 trades a week, use it, lose it. There's no cap on it. Well, there is, but not literally. We could kind of jump off these mid-range guys and jump into something that works a little bit. It's Chero, is it Oliver, is it Peatling at a little bit lower end, is it Parrish, is it Ashcroft? Doherty's popped now with the injury that's landed to Nick Newman, at least in the eyes of the community, if he wasn't already there. Like, how do we choose from this range, as well as then what's the worthwhile score he needs to get in SuperCoach to feel like we've picked the right guy? Have you got any advice for us to navigate that space in SuperCoach?
It is an interesting one, and I actually think it's more interesting this year because there's a lot of value in a lot of lines. Like, we're thinking about Jack McRae and Bailey Smith up forward, Kitty Goldman at back. I mean, even Tom De Koning or Matt Flynn in the ruck, whoever it is. I feel like there's value everywhere. So there's people that are completing their teams that are like, I'm happy with this. And then going, I've still got 300K in the bank. Like, where do I spend this? So then they're just, I don't know, maybe they're turning the Nasiah Wangadeen into a Sheasel just to use that money kind of thing. So in other years, I think this price range is probably more tempting. But yeah, in this year, we're trying to actually spend the last of our money. So I do think there's a bit of a mind shift that it's definitely like, it's there in fantasy, and I'm not sure if SuperCoach is necessarily caught up, is that SuperCoach has got this obsession with you need to start X amount of keepers, whatever the number is, 11 keepers, 12 keepers. But with 40 trades now, we're only a few trades behind what fantasy has. Yeah. So I'm not against guys in this price range. And like, you could look at Ollie Wines and Hayden Young and kind of Matt Krauts last year as guys that could just do a job until their mid-season buy, hopefully make you 100K. And then you could flip them to whatever premium bond or someone's coming off their buy. I think that could start happening in SuperCoach a bit more. Like, we've got 40 trades. If you don't do what I did last year and trade McKercher in and out about 4 or 5 times and waste your trades like that, if you're smart with your trades, I can see a world where you could actually start a bunch of these guys, hope they all make you about 100K, and then you can just kind of flip them at the end at the buy to when you know who the top 8 are. But in terms of how many, I mean, it does depend on your structure. Like, if you're one of those people who doesn't go for the top liners, like kind of avoids Bont and Cherry and Sheasel, you could probably have like a team of all of these guys, but then you're probably pushing really good rookies to the bench, and that might not be a good thing either. So I'm looking at it as probably 2 in the midfield, but for me, Clary is someone I want, so then there's probably only one more spot. So that's how I'm probably looking at it. But everyone's structure is going to be different. Like, I'm trying to not go for the absolute big dogs, but it's only January, things change as well. So
they totally do. Like, do you try to get these rookies off field with a little bit more value, so you don't get as much at the top end, but you're not stuck with these potential 50 scoring rookies that can be on field and really hurt you? You're trying to get 20 points per game of value off, at the very least, all these sort of guys. And that makes sense. And that's where a lot of AFL fantasy coaches have really seen a high team value move early, see some good scoring early because they've not got rookies on the field. But now with 3 of the first 4 rounds of the year best 18, you'd hope these rookie scores are falling away anyway. And so a higher end of premium option could be sitting there. And so, yeah, you might not have Xavier Lindsay's 50 sitting there, but that falls off. So it's going to be interesting to see how the community approaches this mid-price midfield pocket that sits there, let alone, as you've alluded to, these other names through there. And that brings us, obviously, to the conversation to continue around Will Day. In a moment, I want to get your thoughts on fixtures and the early buy. They are one of the teams that play opening round. I'm not too concerned about his role. I think he's still going to have in and around that sort of 50% sort of centre bounce range that you've talked about, where still Newcombe, Warple, Nash and Day feel like the four with a cascading number down around that. But we haven't talked much about the injury history of Will Day. 2 injuries last year, one that cost him their finals, one that slowed him down during the season. It is starting to stack up a little bit for a guy that's been now, 5 completed AFL seasons and never, beside once, only played more than 17 games in a year. They're not all the same one thing, although they're not, Lockie Whitfield type, which never it's the same thing. It's always, he finds a different way historically for the previous 2 years, which has been fine. Does the injury toll start to give you a little bit more concern, even though pretty much all the guys in this mid-range have a reason they're in the mid-range for us?
Yeah, look, it's definitely something to consider. It's, like you said, around this price range, do you look at someone like a Chera? Well, he's got injury worries. Clayton Oliver's got injury worries. None of them, they're priced at this price for a reason, usually because they've missed quite a few games or got subbed out early. So, yes, I think you definitely have to, you'd be silly to kind of wipe it and be oblivious to it. But look, he's so young. And, like our mutual friend Mitch Casey says, you're injury prone until you're not, and you're an Ironman until you're not. Like, it's just so hard to predict. We think about Tim English's year when he went on that hot streak. He was considered one of the most injury-prone players in the league. Same for Lockie Whitfield last year. It's just so tough. Like, I think you definitely have to take it in consideration. And it probably, like, if it's a real toss-up between two, that could be the thing that sways you one way or the other. But it is hard to predict. And, like, with a player this young, could he just have had a couple of freak injuries and then it's all good now? But, yeah, just avoiding someone because they're injury-prone is fair enough. But also then, on the same point, like, you could pick someone that's played 70 games in the last 3 years and then they could miss most of the year. So, yeah, you've got to consider it, but I probably don't give it quite as much weighting as other people, and especially because in SuperCoach, the worst score drops off, a little bit of protection there, best 18, a bit of protection there. Having said that, a lot of us are probably looking at loading up on Darcy and Flynn and Day and Kadeen Coleman and Clayton Oliver. So how many can you have? I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, the injury prone until you're not, Ironman until you're not, that sticks with me quite a bit.
Yeah, and as it should. I think you do have to build that injury profile risk into your side the same way you do with a positional risk, as you do with paying at the top end and needing that. Every team has a profile of risk. It's just knowing what it is and how are you going to protect that should you need to trade your way out of that going pear-shaped for you. The reason you're going for a high risk or a risk pick is you believe there's a significant reward that is going to come that way. And with Will Day, there is a pathway to him being 110 SuperCoach midfielder. For me, I absolutely believe that's right within his potential. If the Hawks keep any trend of what 2024 held into 2025 and a fit Will Day, man, there's a world where he goes 110. There's a world where he knocks on the door of that 100 marker for me in AFL Fantasy for sure. He's not an accumulator. He's not a high ball winner, but he's a quality ball user. And the Hawks do need this in the midfield, given they've got some strength, some big bodies, some competitive contested ball winners. They need his skill set to bring that ball through the midfield and inside forward 50. And if he can stay on the right side of health, this could be a knockout pick. I want to talk buys and fixtures before we look at it from a draft perspective. He's one of a number of teams that does have opening round scoring, which means we get to have a look at not roll. I'm not really needing to see that from him, unlike others through this 50 most relevant where we're like, we want to see the roll and then we'll make a call. With Day, I'm pretty confident he's in that top 4 centre bounce mix. He's going to roll through that midfield. He's going to be one of their core ball movement guys when they want a high quality movement of the ball. So we'll see a score. We'll at least know in AFL Fantasy, all right, what's he got to do to start making some money movements for us? And then in SuperCoach, we won't see the score movement as fast because the price is that 3-week pricing cycle. They do have Sydney opening round. So James Jordan's done a tagging role on a number of players. Do they do that under a Dean Cox coach side? The beauty is we'll see it and we don't have to panic about it, unlike others in round 1 onwards. But then it's Essendon, Carlton, Giants bye, which they share with Essendon. There's two questions there because I want to ask fixture in a moment. In AFL Fantasy, you'll get the double price movement after round 1, then the round 2, then the round 3, and then the bye. In SuperCoach, you do have who should he play every game. So it's not a heap of cash, but would you consider him as a sharp pivot after that round 3 bye? Is that too early to plan for it? Parachuting is a different thing. It's not working, I'm off. But could you see a world where those 3 games alongside opening round against the Swans is enough of a reason to run and jump off him there, which we have done previously on other kind of early round options? Or do you not think that's a valid option when it comes to Will Day?
Probably don't think it is with Will because I just don't think he does have a 137 and 142 or whatever it was last year, but I don't really think he's the big spike score type of guy that's just going to pump out a 170 and get it rolling and you're off. I think he's more of he'll be a more consistent kind of guy, which if you're wanting to keep him, well, just run him for like 3 or 4 weeks, I don't think he's really going to move much. And like you were talking about, Will Day could potentially be a 110 SuperCoach guy, and I back up that statement in terms of he's got the potential, but what I'd need to see in opening round is that he is kind of getting more like 70% CBAs. If he is a 50% CBA guy, I don't think there's any chance he's a 110. And so I would probably need to see that nearly leapfrogging of Nash and Warple. But yeah, in terms of actually keeping him for a bit longer, I think he's more someone that if you did start, you probably keep him to his mid-season buy rather than flipping at the early buy. It's probably where I'd sit with him. And that early buy, I actually don't think that one's a bad one. He shares it with Essendon, and I don't think there's many players in Essendon people are going to be picking. There'll be a couple of rookies, like I think Sard and Keiko are an option. Apparently Alwyn Davey Jr. has been training the house down. Zach Reed's an option. So there's probably like 4 potential cash cows for the Bombers, but I don't really think many people are going to be going towards Essendon premiums. And then like for Hawthorn, I know there's some interest in James Sicily in some circles, but I haven't seen many other Hawthorn names being mentioned. So yes, he's got an early buy, but there's a chance he's actually the only mid-price / premium you've got in that buy. So it might not be that bad of a thing.
Yeah, it's really true. Look, the fixture's okay. There's no clear, easy narratives where you go, he's got a Richmond, for example, in that first month where you go, it's going to be a knockout game. He's going to brain it. He's going to be... So there's nothing that sits there that immediately you go, they've got a really obvious, easy fixture in the first month of the year. So there does start to become some challenges that all coaches should be weighing up, which is what's the mid-pricer I like? Do I like a Cheramore who has a comparable injury profile but has a better fixture on paper, let alone if he heads up into this Nick Newman role? Do I like an Oliver who could be top of the line premium mid? Do I like a little bit lower down? Do I think Peatling could score similar but be at a lower price point? Do I want to get into a Doherty who, does he get the Nick Newman? So this is where we start to look at all those elements together. It's, okay, the injury history, could I get something that pops more? Could I make more money and comparable scoring? It is going to feel a little bit like you mentioned. We're all probably dipping into 1, 2, maybe even as many as 3 of these guys, depending on how we like to build our risk profile in the mids. It's going to feel a little bit, well, what do you like and how do you want to build it? Because the fixture's okay. The injury history, it's no worse than anyone else that we're probably looking at that's through there. It's going to be interesting to see how many people jump on Will Day in 2025.
Yeah, and I have done a bit of a crunching of the numbers of fixture analysis because I do think it's really important, well, for our keepers that you want to have all year because you want the guys starting hot and, you don't want to start the guys who are going to start slow because you'll get them cheaper. But especially for these mid-prices that you might be kind of trying to get some cash out of, it is important. And honestly, I actually think Hawthorn's early run is pretty brutal. Yeah, they begin the year with Sydney in round 0. Like you said, Sydney in round 0, that's hard. Essendon, that's actually pretty easy for a midfielder.
That's fine.
But then they go Carlton, which is hard. GWS is just hard. They have their bye, and then they come out of that with Port Adelaide, which is hard. So I actually, I looked at the DFS data and I played around and converted it into raw numbers so I could kind of filter it and give each team a rating. Hawthorn has the third hardest start to the season for inside midfielders. Only Collingwood and Richmond have harder starts. So that first 5 rounds, that does, it does sound like it's not going to be an easy start for Will Day. The good news is that then between round 6 and 10, they actually have the easiest stretch by
really
far,
opens up.
by a long way. So they've got games against Geelong, West Coast, Richmond, Melbourne, and Gold Coast. All actually very easy matchups in that 5-week stretch. And then if we look at it further, maybe you think about Will Day as a bit of a pod for SuperCoach finals, rounds 21 to 24, they've got a really, really good run home. But is it worth suffering those really tough round 1 to 5 matchups and the early bye? Is that worth it? I wouldn't be surprised in SuperCoach I wouldn't be surprised to see Will Day average in the 90s those first 5 rounds. And then he could go 110 between that next period with those easy games if he gets up to those 70% CBAs we hope for. So I actually reckon his first 5 and then his second 5 games are going to be night and day, night and Will Day.
Yeah, you've worked very hard on that pun. All podcast we've been building to that one pun. The good news, if you're
that
interested,
just came in onto the head.
whatever. I can see you rated that off the screen, mate. Nice try. You're not getting anything past me. What all? The good news is, if you're interested in Will Day, you get a free look in opening round against probably one of the harder oppositions in Sydney. If he goes 120, 130 across the formats, watch everybody flock to him. Despite that early bye, watch the community flock for him because he has scoring pedigree. More in SuperCoach than in fantasy because he's a more high-quality ball user than a volume accumulator. But there is a world where he knocks it out of the break, round 1, everyone starts to go, ugh, I could get a fast money mover. Because as Pigs explained, while the first month looks a little challenging, if he can pop in opening round, and if I can just get something to hold because of that early pop, we know that first game price movement makes a big acceleration for us to get that movement. Okay, well, maybe I could stomach a 90s in SuperCoach and a high 80s in AFL Fantasy if I get a good opening round, knowing that there's a promising month and others will have fallen away and traded out of him. He's a fascinating guy to look at because there's potential of knocking on the door of the top tier in SuperCoach, and there's a potential for a guy that could make a lot of money really fast for you in AFL Fantasy. And if you don't get him, do you parachute to one of the others? Do you drop down from another failed premium down into this territory? For so many reasons, Will Day and the Hawks in general, to be honest, are a really interesting side for what they do and can they repeat what we saw in the middle to back parts of 2024. Draft, well, we're going to see a huge range of outcomes here for whether you're drafting in SuperCoach, AFL Fantasy, or on the Keeper platform. Because if you're drafting by average in AFL Fantasy or on the Keeper platform, you're just not going to think of him. That average in the mid to low 70s is just, you'll forget him. But with the hype around him in the classic community, that's not happening. We'll look at AFL Fantasy and the Keeper platform in a sec, but talk to me about SuperCoach. Where does he go on draft day? Because I could see some reaching and I can see some being hesitant due to that game's history. Where do you think he goes on draft day in SuperCoach, Big?
It is, I think a lot of it for me and his season will depend on what number pecking order he is in that midfield. So I'm just basing it off the fact that I don't think he's leapfrogging the other guys. I think he's probably just in the mix and being around that 60 to 65% CBA guy. If that's the case, I'm probably going to put him in that 100 to 105 SuperCoach point average. Maybe he can get into the high 90s in fantasy.
Yep.
That probably puts him around the 25th to 30th midfielder ranking, somewhere in there. So I could see him being someone's M3 or M4, maybe more M4 in fantasy, M3 in SuperCoach. There's a lot of guys in that range. I've got him in around the same range as guys like Aiden Young, Connor Rosie, Ed Richards. Those guys aren't the number 1 mid at the club, at their squad, and they're probably not even the number 2, but they've still got enough talent to crack the SuperCoach ton consistently, AFL ton every now and then. So yeah, I'll probably put him around that M3, M4 range.
Yeah, I agree. I think in AF, anything more than an M4 is a huge reach. While he's got the potential to be a 90s guy and could even hit 100 in fantasy, you're missing out on some bank 90-plus guys that are absolute certain. Whereas for Day, you're projecting that the body holds up, that the roll holds up, that all these... I just don't think you need to make that big of a leap before an M4 spot. So to me, I can see him as top 30 mid comfortably across the formats. M3 is the earliest you're probably going to need to go in SuperCoach. M4 feels like a pretty safe and right spot. And same too with fantasy. If you can get him about M4 across the format, I'd be pretty happy with that. And then if you are worried about the injury history, where in salary caps, you can just trade your way out of it. The best way to protect an injury history of a guy is you protect it with another pick. Just draft that little bit deeper in the midfield than what you might normally do. So the midfields is always the hardest line to find decent options off the waiver wire and in the player pool. So if you are worried about his or other players' injury histories, just protect it, draft deeper in the mids than you would elsewhere and mitigate that risk a little bit more. Hey, Pig, it's awesome chatting to you. I reckon we might try to get you back just one more time in the 50 most relevant if we can, because there's one player that I desperately need your knowledge on. So can we have you at least once more in the 50 most relevant?
Absolutely. I'd love to.
All right, good. All right.
Now I'm intrigued who this player is.
I'll tell you off air. I'm not going to mention who they do on the podcast, but where can we keep in touch with you across social media? I know Dr. Supercoach is just starting to ramp up, and we'll see some videos from you, especially rolling through on the YouTube channel. Where can we keep in touch with you across socials, and where can we get in touch with the Dr. Supercoach boys too?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm always active on Twitter at pig_DRSC. All the other boys, JB, Pistol, Chizo, and the main Dr. Supercoach page are on Twitter as well. Like you said, the Dr. Supercoach YouTube is probably where I'll be putting out just a few videos over February. So we'll start ramping those up and keep an eye out for those coming up. And we've also got our Dr. Supercoach Patreon, which is always good fun. There's a lot going on in there. Also gets you access to a Slack community group with about 600 like-minded Supercoach lovers. So, I mean, that's always good fun, just bouncing your ideas off people and us. Someone will just pop in, say, hey, what do we think about X player? And then there's about 30 discussions, just bang. And then everyone, by the end of it's got a very good understanding of what we all think about Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller or whoever it is. Chatting to your friends outside of Supercoach, they don't really understand what all the effort and work and what it's all about. But when you get a like-minded group together, it's pretty fun.
Absolutely, it is. Hey, mate, an absolute pleasure talking to you yet again. The good news is we've got a verbal contract now. He'll be back for one more episode in the 50. Wonder who that player is going to be and how quickly he'll get back on the 50 most relevant. I will give you a clue about who's at number 29, though, in a moment, so hang tight for that. If you missed any of those places that Pig has shared about where you can get in touch with him and the Dr. Supercoach community, we put the details in the description of this episode, so you can go and check it out. In there are also the details for the Coaches Panel merch store where you can get in touch with us across social media and our Patreon as well. If you're a breakout or premium tier supporter, you get these audio podcasts a day early, as well as if you are a draft player. Over the next couple of days to weeks, there may be some exclusive opportunities to explore the Keeper draft platform ahead of everybody else. Not promising anything, not guaranteeing it, but just saying, hypothetically, if you want to support the Coaches Panel, you want to get some bonus content, and you'd like maybe an early look at an opportunity at something that nobody else has, just saying, maybe join the Coaches Panel Patreon. That's all there. Hey, if you're watching this on YouTube and you haven't subscribed, it's a click of a button and it's something that makes a huge difference for us. But comment below. Let me know. What do you think Will Day is going to do in 2025? Can he hit that 70 CBA attendance rate that Pig has talked about to get him right on the threshold of being a 110 guy? I'd love to know what you think about that. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast and you haven't subscribed, do so. Give it a 5-star rating. Share this episode with either your Hawthorn supporting mates or those that are in your fantasy footy league and get their take on what Will Day could be in 2025. Number 29 is where we land tomorrow. You ready for a clue? In the last 3 seasons, he has been a top 25 ranked player for all 3 of those seasons across all of the formats. So, how much spare time do you have right now? Because all you've got to do is go and look in the last 3 seasons at who across the formats has been a top 25 ranked player, and you will get a short list of names. Is it a short list of 1? And if it is, congratulations to you, you figured out who it is. Or if it's more than 1, it's a very narrow field of questions. Who is number 29? You'll get your answer by doing that quick task. You'll get close. You can become a Patreon and find out right now, or you can just wait till tomorrow. You're on the 50 Most Relevant.